Assalamu alaikum students, welcome back. This is your lecture 2 of ENG503, that is prose 2. By now you should be familiar with the outline of this module, and you know that in this module we are going to be doing prose fiction. When we started off with the first lecture, I gave you a few points as to what we are going to cover in this lecture and in the module. Now we're going to take it up from where we left off. And where we left off was in this letter that Gulliver's cousin or friend Richard Simpson is supposed to have written to Lemuel Gulliver, in which he is describing what this travelogue will contain. And one of the things that he points out too is the fact that Gulliver is an individual, and he has retired to a remote region because of all the attention that he was getting. Now this attention, according to Richard Simpson, was because Gulliver had traveled to different parts of the world, and when he came to settle in Redriff, there were a lot of people who were curious and who wanted to ask questions and who wanted information. And so Gulliver, not really liking all this attention, retired to a very remote area, and that is where he has sort of settled. What Simpson is trying to say is to establish the veracity of the document, because this is a travelogue that deals with parts of the world that are not present on the geographical map. He needs to make sure that people trust this travelogue, trust this document, and do not raise questions about Gulliver having written something out of his imagination, or even doubting whether a person such as Mr. Lemuel Gulliver actually exists. One of the things that I pointed out in my previous lecture was the fact that Jonathan Swift was known as a misanthrope, or one who hated mankind. And this opinion of Jonathan Swift is based on his writings, which focus on different sections of society, and his manner of writing or communicating is one in which satire is predominant. So whatever he's writing is aimed at a particular section of society. Even the letter that Richard Simpson is supposed to have written obviously was written by Jonathan Swift. And it shows that Swift is targeting particularly the nobility in this travelogue. And towards the end of my last lecture, I presented to you the slide which says that this travelogue is going to be of interest to people in the nobility, because it's going to give them something interesting and something factual to read, because right now what is being published is political pamphlets that slander, that accuse each other of not being patriotic or not doing anything for society. So according to Richard Simpson and according to Swift, it's this section of the nobility, or this section of the society, that needs to read this travelogue in order to realize what is wrong with society. And not just to realize what is wrong with society, but also how it can be righted. So we're going to continue with this letter written by Richard Simpson, and in which he's trying to establish the identity of Mr. Gulliver. Okay? Right. So he says, I was resolved to fit the work as much as possible to the general capacity of readers. Now, if you remember in the last lecture, Richard Simpson had said that in presenting this work to the world at large, he has made a few alterations. And these alterations chiefly are that he has omitted certain details which he thinks are superfluous or would not be of interest to the reader. And these include details of wind and tides, details of the expertise that is required in maneuvering the ship, because remember, Gulliver is sailing as captain. And also it includes details of longitude and latitude which may be of interest to sea-going people or to sailors, but which would not be of interest to people who had not been on the sea, because these are details that sort of bog down the narrative and that do not allow appreciation of the narrative as it should be done. So he says that I was resolved to fit the work to the general capacity of readers. My aim is to present to the world a narrative or a travelogue that would be of interest to readers. I'm not writing or I'm not presenting this world only to the sea-going public or only to a small section of society. I am presenting this to the world at large. And so I have had to prune a bit. I've had to cut off certain sections and meld the work so that it becomes interesting and it doesn't become very boring. However, if my own ignorance in sea affairs shall have led me to commit some mistakes, I alone am answerable for them. So he's absolving Gulliver of all blame, and he says, if there are any mistakes, they are mine. Now you see, this is a very clever way that Swift has adopted of establishing the veracity of or the reality of Gulliver, because he makes Gulliver's friend Richard Simpson write a letter in which Richard Simpson accepts responsibility for all mistakes and everything that has been presented. He gives the credit to Gulliver, but he accepts blame for any shortcoming as his own. So in accepting responsibility, what Richard Simpson is doing is establishing the authenticity of the document. It's not just a work of imagination, it's something that actually happened, and the person who wrote it actually exists. This is the place where he lives. This is what his neighbors think of him. So all this is to establish Gulliver as an individual who lives and who has traveled. So this whole thing is representative of Swift's style. Everything that he says and the way he says it is in order to establish Gulliver as a bona fide traveler, not just a person who exists in Swift's imagination. So Richard Simpson accepts all responsibility, and he says the credit goes to Gulliver. And if any traveler hath a curiosity to see the whole work at large, as it came from the hands of the author, I will be ready to gratify him. So he goes one step further, and he says, if you want to see the whole book, or the whole work, all those papers. I have those bundles of papers, and anyone who doubts that Gulliver actually existed or that it is Gulliver who has written them, he is most welcome to come to me, and I'm going to show him all the work that was submitted to me by Gulliver. And when he compares that with the published account, the individual will be able to see that this is the account that is presented, and the account that Mr. Gulliver actually submitted is far longer, far more detailed than anything that has been published. So all this is to establish Gulliver as an individual. And then he winds up the letter by saying, as for any further particulars relating to the author, the reader will receive satisfaction from the first pages of the book. So, very clever technique that Swift uses. He actually has a name for this person who has written the letter. So it's not just a name, it's a whole identity. Remember, in the very beginning of the letter, he says that I am a close and intimate friend of Lemuel Gulliver, and I'm also related by my mother to the author of these papers. Now, he does not give you the exact nature of the relationship. He doesn't say he's my mother's sister's son or my father's brother's son, but he just says that on my mother's side, I'm related to Gulliver. So a very clever technique, and Swift is full of it. You know, Swift is one of those writers who are right up there as far as prose fiction is concerned. And the fact that he uses satire in order to communicate with his readers just shows you how effectively he can utilize this means of communicating his ideas to his readers. He is not just a hater of mankind. He presents himself as one who loves mankind and who therefore wants mankind, and in particular this section of English society, to mend its ways, and this can only be done if society is shown where it is going wrong. You get that much? Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go on to a letter written by Gulliver to Richard Simpson. Okay? All this is to establish Gulliver's identity. So a letter from Captain Gulliver to his cousin Simpson. Now, Gulliver claims Simpson as his cousin, but Simpson says that Gulliver is a close and intimate friend. Plus the fact that the term cousin is very flexible. It's very much in use even in our society, even in this day and age, it's used. And for somebody coming from the 17th and 18th centuries, this was a term that was very loosely used to define any relative. Anyone could be a cousin. So Gulliver writes to his cousin Richard Simpson, and he gives the year as 1727. And you'll see that Gulliver's manner in writing to Simpson differs slightly from the way in which Simpson has written to him. So Gulliver starts off and he says, I hope you will be ready to own publicly, whenever you shall be called to it, that by your great and frequent urgency you prevailed on me to publish a very loose and incorrect account of my travels, with directions to hire some young gentleman of either university to put them in order and correct the style, as my cousin Dampier did by my advice in his book called A Voyage Around the World. Now, in this long sentence, you see that Gulliver is establishing his identity by writing something related to his travels. And he starts off straight away by attacking Simpson. What he's trying to say, in fact, is that you have done wrong and you will be held accountable for it. What I gave you to write was under some preconditions. One of the preconditions was that you would get somebody either from Oxford or from Cambridge to proofread and edit this work, but you did not do so. Now, in doing that, Swift is playing very safe. What he's saying, in fact, is that if there are any mistakes, any typos, they are Richard Simpson's. So Gulliver here is taking credit for the work, but he is at the same time telling his readers that he is not responsible for the form in which the travelogue appears. That's the work of Richard Simpson. I have nothing to do with it. So what he's saying here is that I am absolved of everything. It is not my fault if somebody says, well, this is not true. This cannot be. So straight off the bat, what he's doing is he's establishing his own identity at the same time that he excuses himself for what has actually been written on the book. And you'll see how smart Swift is and how he turns everything around to making the reader believe that whatever has been written is authentic and that any mistakes that have been made are those of Richard Simpson. So in one sense, Swift is absolving himself of all responsibility because Swift here stands for Gulliver and Richard Simpson is some other individual who was given this assignment or this project of publishing this book after editing it. But Gulliver here says that Simpson did not edit the book the way Gulliver wanted it to be done. And so whatever goes wrong with the book is Simpson's fault. It's not my fault. So you see how he does it. His manner is very different from that of Simpson. Simpson takes the responsibility on himself. He gives Gulliver credit for it. Gulliver does not give Simpson credit. He just blames Simpson for whatever goes wrong with the book. And in order to establish his authenticity, he also gives reference to another book that was published at this time, and that is A Voyage Round the World. And in a simple sentence, and this is not even a complete sentence, he calls attention to this book, and at the same time, he says that the person who published this book got help from outside sources. And the outside sources were somebody who had a degree either from Oxford or from Cambridge. So in one go, he is killing two birds. He is telling people that I did not get anyone from Oxford or Cambridge to edit this, and he's accusing another writer of having done it. So in other words, what I am publishing is my work. I do not have professional help for it. But what you published, you got professional help for it. So my work, by comparison, is going to be better because I've not had any professional looking at it. See how smart Swift is. We'll find more examples of Swift's cunning and what I'd call expertise of dealing with his readers. And then he shifts his angle a little and he says, I did not give you power to consent that anything should be omitted and much less that anything should be inserted. So what he's saying is, I didn't give you the authority to prune the original document. I told you to get it published, but you've not done that. So in any case, you've gone against my specific instructions. I wanted it to be published as it was. I didn't allow you, I didn't give you permission to add or subtract from the original document, but you've done it. So you see what he's doing again is he's keeping himself safe and he is blaming everything onto Richard Simpson. Now Richard Simpson is an outsider, is an fictitious character whom we do not see, but whom Gulliver blames for everything that has gone wrong with the document. So he's outside where we can't see him, but he has done wrong according to Gulliver. So what he's doing is he's apologizing in advance for anything that may have gone wrong with the narrative. So to continue the sentence, and he says, as to the latter, I do here renounce everything of that kind. So whatever you've added is not my responsibility. I am not to be held responsible or accountable for anything that you've added. Whatever you have subtracted or whatever you have deleted from my account is your responsibility. So very cunningly, Swift is telling his readers that whatever has been written here was supposed to be authentic, but if the reader finds any portion that is difficult to believe, it's not Jonathan Swift who has written it, it's some other outsider who has inserted that or who has deleted certain details. So if there's anything that is missing, it's because Richard Simpson took it out. And if anything extra has been added that the reader cannot believe, then Richard Simpson is to be blamed for it. And he gives you an example of this. And the example is a paragraph about Her Majesty Queen Anne, of most pious and glorious memory, although I did reverence and esteem her more than any of human species. Now, Queen Anne was sister to Queen Mary, and Swift in his work makes mention of Queen Anne. The time of Queen Anne is renowned for its emphasis on appearances, so that whatever was done, appearance was of primary importance. And so Swift, because he could not resist hitting out at the nobility, he also satirized the monarchy. But once he had done it, he covered it by saying that I have not inserted anything. I have not said anything derogatory about Queen Anne. You have done it. And the you is Richard Simpson. See how cleverly he manages it. He's written something that directly attacks Queen Anne. But he is also absolving himself of all responsibility by saying, I did not write it. Richard Simpson wrote this. So he's hitting out at Queen Anne, he's criticizing Queen Anne, and then he says, you know, I respect and I reverence Queen Anne, and she is dearer to me than any other human being. So I cannot even imagine saying something like this. It's Richard Simpson who's done it. So, very clever. But you or your interpolator ought to have considered that it was not my inclination, so Was it not decent to praise any animal of our composition before my master Huinam? And besides, the fact was altogether false, for to my knowledge, being in England during some part of Her Majesty's reign, she did govern by a chief minister, nay, even by two successively, the first whereof was the Lord of Godolphin, and the second the Lord of Oxford, so that you have made me say the thing that was not. Very, very clever. A technique that is being used to apologize in advance for whatever he's going to say later. Now, as you go on with the study of Gulliver's Travels, you'll see that one of the voyages that Gulliver undertakes is to Huinam land, and that is a land that is inhabited by a race of horses who are rational, who use logic. He undertakes another voyage to the land of the Yahoos. Now, I know that the generation of today takes Yahoo to mean something that is a search engine or something that you use to make your email addresses on, but the term as it is used by Swift means a race of savages, a race that does not use reason, that is beastly, that is savage, that is uncivilized. And so when he uses the word Huinam, he is talking about a race that uses rationality, that uses logic, that uses its brains instead of its heart. And Swift is full of praise for Huinams. Now, you need to understand the political scenario of the time in order to understand and appreciate what Gulliver and Swift are saying here. He talks about my master Huinam, and then he says that you added something about Queen Anne which I never wrote, which I never said. And one of the things that that Queen Anne was accused of was that she spent very little time in England. And so what Swift says through Gulliver is that she did spend some time in England. You are having me say that Queen Anne never lived in England, whereas I'm a witness that the Queen did spend some time in England and that she governed through chief ministers. And at one time, she had one person looking after the affairs of England. So what he is doing is, he is criticizing Queen Anne, and at the same time he says, I didn't do it. It's Richard Simpson who did. So he's absolving himself of all responsibility. And then, because he's full of appreciation for Huinams, he says that Richard Simpson has praised human beings in front of Huinams. And that is not to be done, because that's not how Gulliver thinks. Gulliver thinks the Huinams are above human beings. They are of a higher category. than human beings. Human beings consider themselves the crown of creation, the center of the universe, etc., etc. But that's not how Swift looks at it. Swift sees human beings as a low species, as species of a lower order than Houyhnhnms. So he says, one, you have stated that human beings are better than Houyhnhnms, and that is something that Houyhnhnms do not like. And the other thing is, you have made me say that Queen Anne never spent any time in England, that she was a monarch in name only, and that the country was ruled by someone else. I never said that. What I have said is that Queen Anne did spend some time in England. So that's one way of criticizing a person. When you say that so-and-so spent some time in England, you're not just pointing to the time spent in England, but you're also pointing to the time that was not spent in England. And that is how you criticize the individual. So what Swift is saying is that this is the work of Richard Simpson. Anything that is unpalatable, anything that is difficult to digest is Richard Simpson. I have written a very truthful account, but when I handed over these papers to Richard Simpson, he made the changes. So blame should be assigned to an outsider, not Gulliver, not Swift. Likewise, in the account of the Academy of Projectors and several passages of my discourse to my master Houyhnhnm, you have either omitted some material circumstances or minced or changed them in such a manner that I do hardly know my own work. So a very, very big accusation for Richard Simpson. Gulliver says that you have altered the document in such a way that it doesn't seem to be my work. You've subtracted things, you've deleted things, you've added things, you have put words in my mouth that I never uttered. So what you have done with this is beyond any forgiveness. So you cannot really say that this is my work, this is your work. Now what Swift is doing very cleverly is that he is absolving himself of all responsibility for the printed work. Remember, Swift also had to live, and his life was in the circle that was known as the Scriblerus Club. And as a member of the Scriblerus Club, he had to be very careful of what he was saying about the nobility, the aristocracy, and the court. Anything that he said against the court would be taken as treason, and anything that is said about the person of the monarch is thought to be treason, and treason is punishable by death, because what you say against the monarch is taken to be against the monarchy. If you say anything about the individual, it's taken about the country, and if you say anything about the country, you are committing high treason. So Swift very cleverly has written these two letters not just to establish the authenticity of Gulliver as a traveler, as a voyager, as a sea captain, but he is also telling the readers that he is not responsible for anything that upsets them, anything that would be considered derogatory about any section of society. So he's, in one sense, he's trying to say that whatever has been published is not my responsibility at all. So you see, a very clever way of getting away from responsibility. So what he's saying is that Richard Simpson has played around with the document, and whatever the end result is, the document that has been published is not really Gulliver's narrative at all. It's something that that Richard Simpson is responsible for. When I formally hinted to you something of this in a letter, you were pleased to answer that you were afraid of giving offense, that people in power are very watchful over the press and apt not only to interpret but to punish everything which looked like an innuendo as you called it. Now, you see how Swift does it. He makes a statement in such a way that he accuses an individual or a section of society of doing something, and then at the same time he says, I didn't do it, I didn't write it. So in order to establish his position, Gulliver says, I wrote you a letter in which I pointed out that you were doing wrong, that you should not subtract or delete or add anything to my narrative. And your response was that you were afraid of giving offense, that you didn't want to offend Queen Anne, or you didn't want to offend the nobility. And Gulliver says that you were the one who said that the court watches the press very carefully, and if anything is said against the court will punish. The court, the monarch, has that authority. And so I am not to be blamed for it. Richard Simpson has done it. I told him not to do it, but he just went ahead and did it because he said he didn't want to give offense to the court. And then at the same time he says, what I said was said years ago, was said at a distance of 5,000 leagues. So how could anything that was said so far away affect my feelings of loyalty and patriotism to the monarchy? So what he's saying is that whatever I have written, I wrote years ago, and I wrote when I was far from England. I was writing about areas, about countries, regions, nations that had nothing to do with England. How could you take something that I wrote about, let's say the Huinam land, to refer to something that's happening in England? I never meant England. I was talking about another place altogether. And whatever I was writing about the Yahoos could not be applied to the present day and age, because I was not talking about the Englishmen. I'm talking about a race that exists outside of England. So in creating Yahoos, in creating Huinams, in creating Laputans and Lilliputians, what Swift is doing is he's actually attacking people at home in England, in the nobility. But he's doing it in such an indirect manner that no one can accuse him of having said anything against the nobility. And so he satirizes without appearing to satirize. Look at this one section of the sentence. He says, how could that which I spoke so many years ago be applied to any of the Yahoos who now are said to govern the herd? So on the one hand he says, I didn't say it, and then he calls the people in the court, the nobility, yahoos. They're not Houyhnhnms, they are yahoos, they're savages, they're beasts, they're uncivilized. So he says, what I said so many years ago and so many thousand leagues far from England, how could that be applied to the savages who rule us? So in one go, he's calling the monarch and the court yahoos, and he's calling the people of England a herd that is governed by a shepherd. Sheep, you know, when they are in a herd, do not have the capacity to think. They do whatever they see the other sheep doing, and that is your herd mentality. When you follow another individual blindly, without thinking, should I be going here or not? So when he talks about a herd of cows or a herd of sheep, he is calling the people of England and animals. He's bringing them down to the level of animals, and he says they're like animals who are told to go in one direction and they go in that direction. They follow the shepherd, or they follow wherever they are told to go, wherever they are moved to go. So he says, whatever I said so many years ago doesn't apply to the savages who are ruling us these days, especially at a time when I little thought or feared the unhappiness of living under them. So in one go, he's relating his own unhappiness. Swift is a master at using the language. He twists words in such a way that they mean the exact opposite of what they appear to mean. So he says, I could not have said anything about the monarchy or about the court when I was not even planning to live here, when I was not present in this country. How could I have said anything against the monarch? It would have been useless. So he's attacking the nobility at the same time that he protects himself from any accusations at all. Have not I the most reason to complain when I see these very yahoos carried by Houyhnhnms in a vehicle, as if they were brutes and those the rational creatures? And indeed, to avoid so monstrous and detestable a sight was one principal motive of my retirement hither. So he goes even further into his description, and he says, I am the one who has seen Houyhnhnms governing. I have seen Houyhnhnms, or horses, acting rationally, planning everything, organizing everything. And now I see that these horses are used to carry these savage noblemen, to carry these brutish beasts. So he says, have not I reason to complain when I see these yahoos, these savage men, being carried by horses? And he's giving a reference to the horse-drawn carriages that brought the nobility to different parts of London, that brought the nobility to the court. So coming from the land of the yahoos and Houyhnhnm land, he places his Yahoo and his Huinam in London society, and he says the horses are the Huinams, the Yahoos are the nobility, those who are very closely connected with the court. So he says, have not I the most reason to complain when I see these savages being carried by these rational creatures, as if those who are riding are rational and those who are carrying them are brutish beasts. And he says, and mind you, it was to avoid this spectacle of savages being carried by rational creatures, or in other words, the noblemen being carried by horses, that I retired to this remote area. In other words, he was sick of the aristocratic society. He did not like them at all. And so it is to escape from the aristocratic society that he goes and settles in a remote corner of England, where no one from the court is ever likely to approach, where no one from the court is ever likely to find him out or to come and start his display in front of Swift, the misanthrope. Thus much I thought proper to tell you in relation to yourself and to the trust I reposed in you. I do in the next place complain of my own great want of judgment in being prevailed upon by the entreaties and false reasoning of you and some others, very much against my own opinion, to suffer my travels to be published. So he says, okay, this is what I wanted to say to you, to show you that you have betrayed my trust in publishing this document in the manner in which it has been published. And now I come to another part of my argument, another reason for writing to you, and that is that I am to blame also. I accept responsibility for the fact that I let you talk me into publishing this entire thing. I trusted you. In other words, what Gulliver is saying is that Richard Simpson betrayed his trust, that Richard Simpson violated the trust that Gulliver had reposed in him. And in believing Richard Simpson, I was at fault. So Gulliver accepts his responsibility in that respect. He says, I was a fool, I trusted you, I should not have trusted you, I should not have trusted your friends, I should not have trusted people who said, give this to Richard Simpson and he will get it published. My fault is in the fact that I trusted you and I gave you this task. So I am to be blamed for that. Pray bring to your mind how often I desired you to consider, when you insisted on the motive of public good, that the Yahoos were a species of animals utterly incapable of amendment by precept or example. And so it has proved. For instead of seeing a full stop to put to all abuses and corruptions, at least in this little island, as I had reason to expect, behold, after about 6 months' warning, I cannot learn that my book has produced one single effect according to my intentions. So again, a very long sentence. Swift uses some very, very long sentences, doesn't he? Anyway, let's break this up and see what Swift is trying to do here. Remember, this is all Gulliver writing to Richard Simpson. And what he says is, I want you to consider, to remember that when you said you were doing this for public good, I reminded you that the Yahoos were animals. The Yahoos were beasts who could not improve, who could not change. And he says, I told you the Yahoos were beasts, and that has proved to be true. It's been 6 months since this book was published, and in those 6 months, no change has come about in society. So what Swift is saying is, no matter what you do, no matter what you say to the nobility and about the nobility, they are not going to change. There's going to be absolutely no change, no reformation as far as Yahoos are concerned. They are incapable of change because they are not thinking human beings. They are animals, and wherever these animals are led, they will go. They do not have the ability to rationalize. They do not have the ability to use logic. They are animals. They are beasts, and beasts cannot change. They cannot change their inner nature. So he says, after about 6 months warning, I cannot learn that my book has produced one single effect according to my intentions. So what he's saying is that the people in England are beyond any reformation. They cannot change for the better. They can only sink lower. And then he goes on to another point, and he says, I desired you would let me know by a letter when party and faction were extinguished. Judges learned and upright, pleaders honest and modest, with some tincture of common sense, and Smithfield blazing with pyramids of law books. The young nobility's education entirely changed, the physicians banished, the female Yahoos abounding in virtue, honor, truth, and good sense, courts and levees of great ministers thoroughly weeded and swept, wit, merit, and learning rewarded, all disgraces of the press in prose and verse condemned to eat nothing but their own cotton, and quench their thirst with their own ink. Okay, now this is a long sentence, and it's going to involve some explanation. Swift basically wants a society that is free of all these things, where the judges are learned and upright, that is, they are honest, they are truthful, and they are learned, where pleaders or lawyers are honest, and they do not make tall claims that they cannot hold on to, and they have common sense, that all law books should be burnt, and that's a very, very strong hit at lawyers. When he talks about Smithfield blazing with pyramids of law books, he is striking out at people who had studied law and who were practicing law. He wants the young nobility's education entirely changed. They should not be trained in etiquette and in the fancy arts, but they should be taught to use their mind, to use the brains that they have been given with. He wants all physicians banished because he says that they do not make you well, they make you ill. And all women practice virtue, honor, truth, and good sense. Now this is a very, very strong satire on women, because he calls them female Yahoos. It's a separate category altogether. He's talking about female animals. So very, very strong remarks about women. He wants the courts and levees of ministers weeded and swept. They should be cleaned of all hangers on. They should only have people around them who are sensible, who are logical, and who work for the betterment of the country, not the betterment of the individual. Where intelligence and learning are rewarded, and where people who write scandalous things in the press are condemned to eat nothing but their own cotton, because cotton is what they're manufacturing. It's something that is without weight, something that just flies all over the place, and which doesn't really have substance. And they should only be given ink to quench their thirst. So very, very strong remarks about the nobility, about women, about the learned people. He doesn't spare anyone. He starts with judges, he goes on to lawyers, he strikes out at the nobility, and he hits out at women, particularly the women in the court, and he talks about those who make laws. He talks about the monarchy, and he talks about learning, intellect. Even those who are writing, men of letters, even, he says, should be punished when they write something against the monarchy or against the good of society. I think we'll stop here, but before we do that, let me quickly go over what we have done today. When we started today's lecture, I continued from the two letters that Swift makes a part of Gulliver's Travels, and these two letters act as a sort of preamble. They establish not just the authenticity of Gulliver as a sea captain and as a voyager, but they also serve to absolve Jonathan Swift of anything that the readers might find objectionable in this narrative. And when he talks about readers, he's talking about the nobility, he's talking particularly about Queen Anne, because in his writings he strikes out at Queen Anne for not spending time in England. And he hits out at the Queen and the nobility through this letter. And he says that I was told by my cousin Richard Simpson that he is editing my narrative so that it will be more effective and it will not make the Queen unhappy. But what he has done is he has deleted certain things and he has added them. He's added things that I never claimed. So any faults that are present in the narrative, any mistakes in the narrative, are Richard Simpson's. And what I pointed out was the fact that there is difference between these two letters that are that form a part of Gulliver's Travels, and the difference is that Richard Simpson assigns all the credit to Gulliver and he accepts responsibility for mistakes. He takes the blame for all the shortcomings in the narrative. Gulliver, on the other hand, when he writes the letter, he does not accept responsibility for anything that is at fault with the narrative. He throws all the responsibility in the lap of Richard Simpson, and he says Simpson is accountable for whatever is objectionable, because Simpson deleted certain aspects and Simpson added certain things which I never said. So Gulliver's letter is different in the sense that he holds Simpson responsible, whereas Simpson accepts responsibility for mistakes and he gives all the credit to Gulliver. The only thing that Gulliver accepts responsibility for is the fact that he allowed Simpson to talk him into handing over all the material. Remember, Simpson says that anyone who wishes to take a look at the entire narrative is welcome to come to me, and I'll show him that Gulliver's narrative has been pruned and edited. It is not presented in the same way in which Gulliver wrote it down. But Gulliver, on the other hand, says that all the mistakes, all the faults are Richard Simpson's, and he goes on to accuse Simpson of having tampered the material that was given to him. He says, you have not only deleted sections of my narrative, but you have also inserted things, and one of the things that he particularly points out to is the fact that Simpson makes Gulliver say that the Queen did not spend any time in England, whereas Gulliver says that I know she did, and I know that what she was doing was governing through her chief ministers. So I have absolutely no objection to that. Now, when Gulliver says that this is something that Richard Simpson has made him say it, he's actually not only accusing Simpson of having added material, but he's also absolving himself of all responsibility. He has said things in Gulliver's Travels that are against the monarchy and against the nobility. He has hit out at certain sections of society, but he does not want to be held accountable for them. He doesn't want to be penalized for anything that he has said. So he shifts the responsibility on to Richard Simpson, whom we never see. Simpson is an outsider. We never encounter him. We do encounter Gulliver, but we do not ever see Richard Simpson. So he's a fictitious character that Swift has introduced in order to take all the blame for whatever the readers might find objectionable in Gulliver's Travels. And he has targeted all sections of society. Starting from the Queen, he goes through the list. He attacks the judges, he attacks the lawyers, he attacks women, he attacks the ministers, and he calls all of them yahoos. And he objects to the fact that these savages are being carried around, are being transported by horses. And for him, horses in the form of houyhnhnms symbolize rationality, symbolize logic. So according to him, these savage beasts are being carried around, and he says that it is because I cannot tolerate the very sight of these savages, these yahoos being carried around by sane, rational, logical houyhnhnms. And that is the reason why I have shifted to this remote corner of England, and I refuse to have anything to do with yahoos. So this is the gist of what we have tried to discuss in this lecture. We're going to continue with this in the next lecture also, and once we have finalized and ended Gulliver's letter, then we'll go on with the text of the first voyage, and that is to the land of Lilliput. So thank you for being so patient, and for now, Allah Hafiz.